So welcome to the webinar again. My name is Joshua Stenhouse and I'm the technical evangelist at Zerto. I've been with the company nearly 3 years now, and in that time I've covered enterprise accounts all over the world from a sales engineering perspective. But one important thing to be aware of is that before working for Zerto, I was actually an end user of Zerto. So I installed, tested, and used it in my VMware vSphere environment starting back in 2011. So a lot of the experience that I talk about and I'll refer to in this webinar today is very much from the perspective of both me using it and then me selling it for quite a number of years thereafter, and how Zerto integrates into your virtual environment on all levels. So again, any issues with the audio, please let me know. Might have to switch the connectivity up, but we'll see how we get along. So at Zerto, we saw a problem with BCDR, and that was that replication in an enterprise environment was being done between the storage arrays. And so you were just selecting the LUN and then placing those virtual machines on that LUN and having it replicated. There was no awareness of what that data actually made up and that it made up your virtual machines. It was just dumb LUN-based replication. And then you might have to use some kind of extra software solution such as VMware SRM to try and take that dumb storage replication with no virtual awareness and map it into your virtual environment. But by doing it this way, there is a complete disconnect between you wanting to replicate and protect your virtual machines, but then having to configure and match the storage arrays in order to have them replicated and protected for disaster recovery. And the whole point of virtualization is to remove physical ties, and that's why you've seen a trend over the last few years of everything becoming software defined, such as starting with the servers, then the networking and the security, firewalls, load balancers. And what Zerto is doing is we're taking the final physical tie, which is the replication between matching storage arrays, we're moving it into the hypervisor and making it completely software defined and replicating in the hypervisor on a per VM level to truly realize the benefits of virtualization. So our solution, Zerto Virtual Replication, is 100% virtual aware. And in this webinar, I'm going to go into lots of detail as to how it's virtual aware, so I won't expand on it now. But it is software only. We're not relying on any physical appliances for the replication. It's all virtual appliances and software, which is why Zerto is storage agnostic. And starting in version 4.0, which is due for release the end of this quarter, it is also going to be hypervisor agnostic. And I'll go into more detail of that in a few slides' time. But important, and most important of all, is that Zerto is enterprise in class. And this means a few things. Starting off, that it means a recovery point objective of seconds, a recovery time objective of minutes, and Zerto will never impact the performance of your protected virtual machines. But as again, in terms of the individual features, we're going to go through these one by one later on in the deck. So if we look at the Datacenter Topologies supported by Zerto, and I'm very much referring to the 4.0 release, not the release that's out here today, because in 4.0 there's some extremely cool things coming down the road. But we support basic VMware vSphere to VMware vSphere replication and recovery, replacing the storage replication and SRM. We'll also support replicating from VMware vSphere to Microsoft Hyper-V. We'll support replicating between Microsoft Hyper-V instances. And finally, replication and recovery from Microsoft Hyper-V to VMware vSphere. And the target virtual machines disks are created in their native format when you protect the virtual machines. So we're just taking the change blocks from one site, inserting them in the target disk in the other, and automatically converting the VM on the fly so that you don't have to wait for any lengthy conversion process. In terms of cloud topologies, we support replicating to our managed cloud providers, our managed cloud providers such as Kelway, Bluelock, Colt, Terramark. And many of these cloud providers actually use Zerto to replicate within their cloud. And a new feature coming in 4.0 is the ability to replicate from your on-premise Hyper-V or VMware infrastructure up into Amazon Web Services. In terms of the data center requirements, Zerto supports both vCenter and System Center Virtual Machine Manager for integration and for the virtual awareness. Whether you're running Hyper-V or ESXi plugged into those does not matter from a Zerto perspective, because in this 4.0 release it is going to be hypervisor agnostic. It's a minimum of SC-VMM 2012 R2 or vCenter 4.0 Update 1 onwards are the minimum supported versions of Zerto. We require a management Windows VM on which to install our management service for the GUI and the interaction, which needs to be 2 vCPUs, 4 GB of RAM, have at least 40 gig of disk space, and 1 static IP address. In terms of the underlying hypervisor, it's a minimum of Server 2012 R2 Hyper-V or ESXi 4.0 Update 1 onwards. As Zerto is storage agnostic, the storage can be shared storage, direct attached, NAS, anything that is presenting a data store to that hypervisor, Zerto can replicate from and to. And then in terms of the available bandwidth, it needs to be a minimum of 5 meg symmetric available bandwidth, i.e. both up and downstream. In terms of the installation process for Zerto, it is extremely simple. And the first task is to install our Zerto Virtual Manager service into the management VM provisioned and pair it to the vCenter or the System Center for the integration into the virtual environment and the virtual awareness. The Zerto Virtual Manager is deployed 1 per System Center or vCenter, so that in the event of a disaster, you can log into the opposing site Zerto Manager to initiate the disaster recovery. It's managed via a vCenter plugin, via a web browser, and you can use PowerShell or a REST API to interact with this Zerto Manager. Once you've deployed the Zerto Manager, the next task is to deploy our virtual replication appliances, and this is done from the Zerto Manager GUI itself. And you simply deploy 1 appliance per host that you're replicating from and to. And the reason that we recommend 1 on each host is so that you get all of the support for VMware features and Hyper-V features, i.e. migration of VMs between hosts, so that we can continue the replication as you move virtual machines around your infrastructure. And the reason we have 1 appliance per host is to create a simple, scalable architecture, because the larger the environment, then you simply increase the number of replication appliances and you increase the replication horsepower available. There's no downtime or impact for deploying these virtual replication appliances, and they are very small in their footprint. I'm talking 1 vCPU, 1 to 3 gigabytes of RAM, 12 gigabytes of disk space, and 1 static IP address, and you can assign the appliances to any VM port group that you want to send the replication traffic across. It doesn't have to be a management network, it can be if you want, or you can provision a dedicated VM network for the replication traffic to go across the sites. Once you've installed the Zerto managers and deployed your replication appliances, the next step is to pair the Zerto managers together, which then share the management traffic and allow you to configure a replication target of the virtual machines between the sites. You then configure the site-wide bandwidth throttling of the replication traffic, which can be done on a time schedule, and by default all the traffic is compressed by a built-in LZ4 compression engine, which you typically see a 50% plus compression ratio and any changes. So here you can see we have our management traffic between the Zerto managers, and our virtual machine traffic between the VRAs for any changes occurring in the protected virtual machines. In the target site, we need to configure the port groups and vSwitches that you want to use for both connecting the virtual machines to when failing over and when testing the failover. And for test failovers, we recommend creating isolated port groups that are not routable to production to allow you to do failover testing in working hours. And then finally, in the recovery site, you should ensure that you have sufficient space for storing the replicated virtual machines. We recommend a minimum of 30 gigabytes free, plus the total source VM provision size, and then around 10% maximum for the journal space for the data change. There is a journal sizing tool available on our self-service portal, which will allow you to put in the figures and get a more accurate understanding of the data space that you're going to use for that journal. In terms of our upcoming support for replication to AWS, the architecture is slightly different, but the underlying way it works and the interface is actually exactly the same. So for replication to AWS, then your source site, whether it's VMware or Microsoft Hyper-V, is exactly the same. And in the recovery site, we need a connectivity to your AWS VPC. But without the connectivity, there's no ability to replicate. So you can start with a VPN for a proof of concept and maybe change that up to a direct connection later on. Once you've got that connectivity in place, then the next step is to create a large Windows EC2 instance and install the Zerto Cloud Appliance software, which is just a simple Windows installer. You give it the access keys required so it has permission in AWS, and then you pair your local Zerto manager to your Zerto Cloud Appliance instance to allow the replication up into AWS. And then the Zerto Cloud Appliance automatically creates an S3 storage bucket in the same region as the Cloud Appliance, no user interaction required. And once you've done this, you're now ready to configure the replication not only between VMware, Hyper-V, also up into AWS. Once your Zerto managers are set up, the next step is to configure which virtual machines you want to replicate and protect. And all of the replication in Zerto is done on a per protection group basis. So we call these virtual protection groups, and you typically build these per application. So if you have multiple virtual machines that form a single application, such as your ERP, CRM, or SharePoint system, if you place them in the virtual protection group, it's a consistency grouping of the virtual machines, ensuring they are all recovered to the exact same point in time, ensuring a recovery is consistent, because the replication and the recovery is on a per protection group basis. You can specify the boot order of the virtual machines, ensuring that, for example, database VMs come online in front of the web server VMs, ensuring the application recovers in a working state. You can select the target site settings, i.e. which hosts and networks you want to connect the virtual machines to, as well as specifying the SLAs around that protection. You can configure the target site storage in terms of which data stores you want to replicate virtual machines to. It doesn't have to match the source site. You can pre-seed the virtual machine data so that you don't have to send all of the changes across the wire. We can automatically reconfigure IP and MAC addresses as part of a failover operation or leave them the same. And then finally, you can configure offsite backup, which allows you on a schedule of hourly, daily, weekly, monthly, or yearly to take backups of your Zerto replicated data in your recovery site to a separate storage device, which could be a deduplicated data domain or Avamar type device, or even just SAN storage presented to your remote Zerto manager. But the beauty of this feature is that even if your remote storage, your shared storage was to go offline, by having the offsite backup to a separate storage device, you always have the ability to recover because you've always got a point in time recoverable to any Zerto manager, any vCenter or system center. Then finally, once you've configured these settings, the virtual protection group is created, and it will either do an initial sync of all of the data, or it will do a delta sync of just the changes if you've selected to pre-seed. Once you've created this protection group, this is when the virtual awareness of Zerto really kicks into effect, and you start to see the value proposition of this virtual awareness, because the day-to-day changes that happen in your virtual environment are automatically updated and reflected in Zerto. You don't have to constantly manage the BCDR in recognition of the changes that you're making. I have a quick question here, and it is the storage used for replication on the secondary site deduplicated? The storage used for replication is not deduplicated by Zerto. However, you can place it on a deduplicated storage device. The reason we don't deduplicate the storage in the secondary site is because then if you click to recover, we wouldn't be able to guarantee the exact same performance as production. Therefore, you can do it at the hardware layer, but we don't do it at the software layer. So once you've created this protection group and you've deployed Zerto to the infrastructure, then any changes such as a vMotion or a live migration of the virtual machines between the hosts, be it a manual operation or done automatically by the likes of DRS, then because you have a Zerto replication appliance on each hypervisor, then Zerto sees that that VM has moved and it carries on the replication. There's no break in the protection and there's no change needed from a Zerto perspective. And we actually also allow you to change the target host, cluster or resource pool that you're replicating that VM to if in the circumstance of performing, for example, host maintenance in your target site as well as your source site. We also support storage vMotions of the protected virtual machines disks. So if, for example, after 3 months you have all of a sudden want to change the location of one of your virtual machines to a different data store, then you just simply right-click in your vSphere client, storage vMotion the protected VMs, VMDKs to a different data store, and Zerto carries on replicating and protecting, no change needed, no impact whatsoever, which is pretty cool. But we also allow you to storage vMotion the replica disks. So if you need to change the target location in the target site, then this is also possible with no break in the replication. So it's really allowing you to be extremely flexible with your protected virtual machines, because once the Zerto protection is in place, it doesn't matter which host or storage you vMotion the virtual machines to, the replication and protection is always going to be there running in the background, which, if you're just talking maybe 5 VMs might not be a big consideration, but as you scale up the protection to hundreds or maybe thousands of virtual machines without these two features, then anything that was set up and worked day one, 6 months down the line, is going to be half broken for many VMs because it doesn't have that virtual awareness. It's not the case with Zerto. We support replicating both physical and virtual raw device mappings, and by default we will replicate these to a thin VMDK in the target site, or if you pre-provision the exact same size RDM in the target site, we can replicate and protect from an RDM to an RDM. Another quick question is, what if you change the VPG group of a virtual machine? And that's a good question. So right now, the process for that would be to remove the VM from the existing protection group, select to keep its disks in the target site, add the VM to the protection group you want to move it to, and then select the pre-seed option, the existing copy of the disks, and Zerto will very quickly just get back in sync and send any changes. Later in this year, we plan to release a workflow that does this automatically, reducing that admin time. But right now, it is a slight manual process, but it is possible without resending all of the data, just the changes that occurred while it was unprotected. We also support live adding, removing, or resizing the disks. Apologies, I think I just lost the audio for a second. I'll just repeat myself. We also support adding, removing, or resizing the virtual disks on the fly. So if you add a new VMDK to a protected VM, that is immediately recognized and then replicated and protected between the sites. Please, anyone, if you're having difficulty with the audio, let me know via question or the chat window. But the cool thing here is that this also includes removing a disk and resizing it. I think one of the most common things I was always doing in my virtual environment wasn't necessarily adding disks, it was always resizing them. It was an extra 50 gigabytes here, 100 gigabytes there for this file server, that application server, and the fact that Zerto sees that and carries on replicating and protecting is a great advantage to have, because you don't have to go back in there and configure it. The only consideration I would make you aware of is that if you resize a protected VMDK to a size that is larger than the target data store supports, then this of course is going to create an issue, and Zerto will actually put the protection group into a needs configuration state, so it will alert you that you need to select a different data store for storing that target disk because the target data store isn't big enough. And then we also support adding, removing, or reconfiguring all the virtual NICs inside a protected virtual machine. So as I said, by default, we keep the exact same IP and MAC of the NICs. If you change that static IP or you add a new NIC and add a new static IP, it's immediately replicated so that when you click to recover, then that NIC is there in the protected VM. On a per NIC basis, you can select different port groups to connect the virtual machines to in the recovery site. It doesn't have to be one or all. So if you had a complex VM with 6 virtual NICs connected to 6 different port groups, then it's very easy in Zerto to have all 6 connected to different port groups in the recovery site and change or not change those IPs and MAC addresses on a per NIC basis for both failover and testing. And I'll be honest, I'm sure there's quite a few other day-to-day features that you use in a VMware environment that Zerto supports that I might not have covered here, but for me, these are the most important and the high-level ones. If you think of any others that you'd like to ask questions on, please feel free to put them in the question window and we'll answer them as we continue. Once you've created that protection group and we've established this real-time replication and virtual awareness, then Zerto is replicating the changes as they are occurring, and it's replicating block level changes near synchronously on a per VM and protection group basis, delivering a recovery point objective of just seconds. We have the built-in compression of those changes, so the replication traffic is always compressed. And because we're replicating the virtual machines in the hypervisor using our virtual appliances, this is exactly how Zerto allows the any-to-any replication between any different storage, because from a Zerto perspective, it just does not matter what that underlying storage is. You can replicate from HP to EMC, NetApp to Dell, it just does not matter. But what does matter is that Zerto is replicating with no performance impact in your protected virtual machines, because we're not using any form of snapshots whatsoever. All that happens is when we see a change on a protected VM, a copy of that block level change is sent to the replication appliance asynchronously, which then compresses, replicates, and inserts a copy of that in the target site. And in the target site, that's actually first inserted in a Zerto journal. And the reason it's inserted in a journal is it allows you to recover to any point in time up to 5 days in the past. But actually, this has actually been extended in Zerto 4.0 because we're now going to allow recovery to any point in time up to 14 days in the past. So from any second, any point in time in those 14 days, the journal maintains the write order fidelity of all the writes in the virtual protection group, allowing recovery to increments every few seconds, which I'm sure you'll agree is extremely powerful. And we also automatically resize this journal to meet the SLAs defined. And what this means is that if, for example, you set the journal to maintain 48 hours of history, you can actually set a maximum size whereby it will not go above 100 gigabytes. If it does, you can put a maximum limit so it won't go above. You can set it to burst above if required, and we'll give you alerts and alarms depending on what happens to that journal. But the important thing is that it automatically resizes to reclaim space back, because if 100 gigabytes changes week 1 and only 1 gigabyte changes week 2, then you don't want all of that wasted space sat in your recovery site, and Zerto reclaims it back because the journal is just a thin VMDK on a per VM basis, where you can even specify a separate target data store on which to store the journals. They don't have to be in the same site, the same data store that the replica virtual machines are on. And what does this continuous data protection and journal technology mean? Well, it means that recovering to previous points in time is as simple as selecting the checkpoint here, and you can see the increments every few seconds. So you're just going to simply rewind back in time to those increments every few seconds up to the 14 days in the past, which means you're not just protected against a natural disaster in your primary site, you're protected against logical failures such as a database corruption, a user error, or even a system-wide virus, because you can simply select the point in time before that logical failure occurred, meaning you don't have to accept the data loss of going to the last backup or snapshot, because you can recover from a few seconds before that failure occurred. We support both crash and application consistent points in time in the journal technology, and most importantly is that we recover all of the VMs in the protection group to the exact same point in time selected here, ensuring a consistent recovery of your application. In terms of the failover automation and orchestration piece, to initiate a failover, you simply log into the target site Zerto Virtual Manager and you click on the live failover workflow, and this automates the recovery, automatically bringing the virtual machines online in the correct order, changing the IP addresses, connecting them to the relevant port groups, delivering a recovery time objective of just minutes. Another quick question here regarding the point-in-time recovery. Is that based on the customer-defined SLA points or single-digit second-based? So that's a good question, in that it's always the single-digit second-based for a time frame that you can set either a customer to specify, or as a cloud provider, or as a IT department with many different organizations, you can actually set SLAs and push them out to multiple sites for the journal retention period and the history settings. But whatever time period you specify to keep the journal for, the points in time available in it are the single-digit seconds. As well as delivering a recovery time objective of minutes, Zerto also gives you the ability to test the failover, and the same click to failover, you click to test, we'll bring the virtual machines online in minutes, connect them to an isolated network that you specified when creating the protection group, and we do this with no shutdown in production and no break in the replication, allowing you to do your disaster recovery testing in working hours in minutes. And because it's so simple to do this disaster recovery testing, we don't just see Zerto used for testing for disaster recovery, we actually see people using Zerto day to day for simplifying testing of upgrades and patches before applying them to production. And we also have a great feature called an offsite clone, where you can select a point in time in the journal, select a target data store, and we will clone all of the virtual machines from that point in time and create them as full VMware clones in the inventory with that timestamp in the name, where you can use it for creating long-term dev test environment copies of your production applications and virtual machines. And then finally, failback with Zerto is a single checkbox where we automatically reverse the replication and start replicating the changes back to production. It just sends the changes. It doesn't resend all of the data. You don't have to reconfigure all of the protection groups. And we also remember all the previous IP and MAC address settings. We also remember the previous VM hardware settings if the VM has been converted on the fly, if you're doing cross-hypervisor replication. Here you can see a screenshot of our new GUI in Zerto 4.0. It's completely HTML5 based, and this means that you have a single management interface for both VMware vSphere, Microsoft Hyper-V, and AWS, all from a consistent interface, which means that you're reducing the complexity and the management overheads because you don't have to learn a completely different BCDR solution for each virtual infrastructure and hypervisor. It provides site-wide statistics in terms of the number of protection groups, the number of VMs in those protection groups, the total data set protected, the average recovery point objective being achieved with the real-time replication, and the compression of those changes as they are being sent across the wire. And as part of Zerto 4.0, we also have a completely new workflow for creating our protection groups, which allows for bulk creation and editing, which means that as you scale Zerto up in a large environment, it's extremely simple to reconfigure all of the network addressing or the storage locations of the target replica disks for multiple virtual machines and disks in just a couple of clicks. We also have our Zerto Cloud Manager, and this is included in the same licensing bundle. And what the Zerto Cloud Manager is, it's actually our manager of managers, where from a single pane of glass, you can manage multiple Zerto managers and see the status of all your multiple sites. Say you had 4 vCenters, 2 system centers, and an AWS instance. You install one Zerto manager for each of them, but you can add all of the Zerto managers in here to give you that central location and that central interface for managing all of the replication, the recovery, and it also allows you to provision and manage the multi-tenancy for DRAS, intra-cloud, and just general BCDR for internal organizations. It provides you the ability to provide service profiles for each of your DRAS customers, intra-cloud customers, or internal organizations, where you can set the service profiles in the Zerto Cloud Manager and have them pushed out to all the Zerto managers. It includes the VCD integration, so Zerto can automatically bring virtual machines online and register them in a VCD organization. And we also allow from the Zerto Cloud Manager to provision Zerto self-service portals to allow each of your internal organizations or customers the ability to manage their own virtual machines and you can change the permissions and give them the ability to perform their own tests or their own failovers on a per virtual protection group basis. And again, this is all included in the software. So to wrap up, that is Zerto Replication with a heavy slant on the upcoming 4.0 release, which, as I said, is at the end of this quarter. If you have any questions, I'm going to stay online for the next 10 minutes and answer them case by case. I'll answer them by speaking and I'll repeat the question so we can cover it for everyone. But if you're leaving now, thank you very much for your time. If you're staying, I look forward to your questions. A question here is, how long does it take for a VM to be brought up in a failover test? So once you've clicked to recover the virtual machine on the most basic level, it is a simple process of the replication appliance in the target site registering the virtual machine in the inventory, attaching its disks from the point in time selected, attaching its virtual NICs to the relevant port groups, and then powering it on. So you can typically expect this to take 2 or 3 minutes, depending on the number of VMs, the number of hosts, and the speed and responsiveness of the target vCenter, or system center for that matter. The next question I have here is, what if a VM on the primary site is corrupted? What happens on the secondary site? So any data corruption in that VM is replicated across to the recovery site within a few seconds, but because Zerto maintains the write order fidelity in a journal, then you can recover the VM by recovering to the point in time before that corruption occurred, allowing you to still have a recoverable VM and recover from that situation. If, for example, you were using a synchronous storage-based solution, then that corruption would immediately be replicated and you would have to go back to the last backup or snapshot. Don't be shy. Any more questions, feel free. So I'll just give it a couple more minutes for any more questions and then we'll conclude the webinar. You've certainly been very nice to me today, guys and girls. I haven't had any question that was really mean, which is a shame. They're my favorite ones. Right. Well, I haven't seen any questions for a couple of minutes now. If you do think of anything going forward, please feel free to send me an email to joshua@zerto.com. And oh, I've got a quick cheeky question at the end there. So I did ask for some trouble, and the question is, what are the top 3 questions you get asked? That's a good one. So it really does depend on the country that you're presenting Zerto to, because I'll be honest, each different country that you speak to has a different set of users, and they usually have different concerns and questions around Zerto replication. But I can tell you, for example, at a VMware event, what the number 1 question I would receive is how do you work with, or what do you do with regards to VMware Site Recovery Manager? I'd say that's probably the number 1 question I get at any VMware event. And the simple answer is Zerto replaces Site Recovery Manager, and we also replace the replication underneath. And this allows you then to replicate and protect on a per virtual machine basis, completely storage agnostic, but enterprise in class, because we have our consistency grouping of VMs, the RPO of seconds, the RTO of minutes, and our journal-based protection. But actually where we differentiate even further from SRM in the 4.0 release is that by adding the support for Hyper-V, cross-hypervisor replication, and support for AWS, then in terms of a strategic investment in a BCDR solution, Zerto is going to allow you the flexibility to reuse your licenses going forward. If in 3 years' time you decide to move to Hyper-V, you can reuse the exact same Zerto licensing. So in terms of a strategic decision, Zerto is going to support you going forward no matter which storage, hypervisor, or cloud you use. SRM is very much a point solution tied into VMware vSphere and tied into the storage for an enterprise class replication engine, which leads me on to my second most common question, is how are you different from vSphere replication, which, as I'm sure you know, you can also plug into SRM. Now, vSphere replication was very much designed for replicating a handful of virtual machines from a remote satellite office, and more of just bringing the VMware vSphere feature set in line with Microsoft Hyper-V. The reason I say it's designed for just a handful of virtual machines is because it has no consistency groupings, and there's no way to control when it is or isn't replicating. There's a fantastic VMware blog post out there which is trying to calculate when vSphere replication will or won't replicate. It does actually blow your mind about halfway through, because the simple answer is you can't tell, because you set the RPO slider and then it will, depending on the data change rate, try and replicate as often or not within that profile. But what that means is that if you have 50 virtual machines protected with vSphere replication, all 50 are replicated to random points in time. So if I ask you what point in time can you recover that environment to, the answer is I don't know. So that's why it's only good for a handful of VMs, because if you take that exact same environment with Zerto, then all those VMs are in the consistency groupings and they're all recoverable to a point in time a few seconds ago, with the ability to prioritize the replication traffic on an SLA basis, the journal-based protection, and the support for multiple hypervisors and replication to AWS. And then I'd say the third most common question I get is, how does the replication actually work? Which hopefully I explained in the architecture diagram of the single replication appliance per host, and all of the changed blocks are asynchronously sent to the appliance, which then compresses, replicates, and inserts a copy in the target stack. So top 3 questions done. So the actual question that's just come up now is, where can I get a copy of these slides? And we'll actually share this webinar out so that you can replay it. So I think we'll call it a day at that. Thank you very much for your time. I hope you enjoyed the session, and I look forward to seeing you on a future session. Thank you very much.